He has been active in the ocean drilling program as well. He has analyzed Martian rocks for the evidence consistent with the presence of life. That evidence has not been forthcoming yet, but one of these days. Rick Colwell is also a professor in our College of Oceanic and Atmospheric Sciences, has his PhD in microbiology from Virginia Tech. And Rick's interests extend to microbiology and methane hydrate systems, to the bioremediation of contaminants such as trichloroethylene in groundwater. And he is also the co-principal investigator of a recently funded project under a new initiative funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation called the Deep Carbon Observatory. And I'll be anxious, as some of you will be too, I imagine, to hear some of the results of that work coming out in the near future. So please give a Science Probe welcome to Marty Fisk and Rick Colwell.
So, do you want to?
What's that?
Do you want to have a seat, or how do we do this?
I can have a seat while you're starting.
Yeah. Well, I'm really excited to be here. I bet Rick is too. When we got invited to do this, I was thinking, this combines three things that I think are a lot of fun: pubs. Talking about astrobiology, and what I call the shadow university. So university level instruction outside the walls of the university. So I think this is a great opportunity to do something like this. I also want to thank the Old World Deli. This is a great place to do this. OMSI, which makes this available, makes this possible. OSU and the Corvallis, the Downtown Corvallis Association. I also want to thank Nick Houtman for all the logistics and the invitation, and Larry Pribble for additional logistics and sound and video, audio and video. I think we want to thank all the audience here, and we know there's audience elsewhere. Hopefully we can keep them engaged as we go along. We know Corvallis is a very intelligent community, and sometimes we feel a little worried about that the people out in the audience know more about this than we do. Yeah, that's right. Rick and I teach a class called Astrobiology. It's a 10-week, 20-lecture course, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight in a nutshell. So either we have to talk really fast or leave something out. And I think we'll probably do some of both. So what is astrobiology? I got a few clues here on the bottom of this slide. How did life start? Is there life elsewhere? How are we going to find it? Where are we going to look? And Rick and I have research interests that cross into these areas. And I brought a rock because I'm a marine geologist. I've studied volcanic rocks in the ocean basins for a long time, and this is a typical example. This lava, or basalt, is came from the ocean floor, and that ocean floor covers about 60% of the Earth's surface, so it's a very, very common rock. And you'll notice it's got this really shiny surface, and it's also full of cracks. And I want to show you how this forms, because it's important for my research, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later in the presentation. So I want to go to the first slide, and I guess I do that, don't I? And so this is an aerial photograph of the coast of the big island of Hawaii, and some of you may know there's an eruption that's been going on there for many years, and sometimes it goes into the ocean, and this is one of those places where the lava is flowing into the ocean. And this is one place where you can find lava interacting with water, and that's what this next video is about. And this is a picture, a movie taken by Richard Pyle, and it should have some sound with it. And you'll notice, obviously, it's red hot to begin with. It's cooling off very quickly, which makes this glass on the outside. And obviously, it's going to be cracked by the really cold water that it's hitting. This is some pretty fantastic footage, and you'll see the photographer's swim fin in a minute. So he's backing up as this thing is coming toward him. So but that's enough introduction for me, and I would like to let Rick do his introduction, and we'll carry on from there.
Okay, so you have to shout at me if I'm talking too loudly. I get excited and start talking in more than a conversational tone. Before I forget, I would like to thank also a couple people. I think, Marty, did you thank Sherry? Sherry? Okay, you will at the end, right? I'm going to thank Heidi, my Valentine. She came tonight despite the fact that we should be perhaps somewhere else. So thank you. And I'd also like to thank the 10 or so students that join us every spring in this class, because this honors class that we teach really is accelerated by their curiosity, their interest in this. Okay, so I want to give you a little background on myself, just briefly, hopefully, to indicate why I have an interest here. I studied geomicrobiology, and to put it bluntly, in about 1990, a fellow geologist grabbed me by the scruff of the neck, and he said, I want you to work on one of these with me, one of these drill rigs. We're going to collect samples from deep underground, and we want to look for microorganisms. And I squalled about that. I was used to working in a lab at that point, didn't really feel a strong interest to go out and work with that kind of sampling device. But I went, and I had a great time doing it. And so now we either sample using big tools like the drill rig on the right, or, as you can see on the left, kind of a strange image of a group of people underground in a gold mine. That's another way that we get samples. We collect these samples. Marty brought one beautiful rock. I brought 3 modest rocks. These are cores that would be collected using a drill rig like this, one sandstone, one basalt, and we can pass these around, that's okay. And what we do is collect these cores and then crack them open and extract the microorganisms or the signatures of their presence from inside these rocks. And then we carry out extractions. You can see at the very bottom, it's a method of examining the DNA, or could even be RNA, present within the cells that we've cracked open here. To be honest, it's a little bit like CSI microbiology. That's probably the best way to explain it. And we try to ask questions or answer questions such as who's present in these samples, or how many are present there, what are they doing, how fast are they doing it. In many cases, the questions are really to gain fundamental knowledge about the Earth. But in some cases, they really have practical benefits, like the remediation of contaminants that may be present in aquifers, or, as we're finding, possibly the use of organisms in the storage of carbon underground, which is becoming a bigger and bigger question. So this map shows globally some of the places that we've looked for microorganisms underground. These aren't all the places that I've been, but this is the community of microbiologists worldwide. And I've tried to color code these so that if people were looking for microorganisms related to the presence of hydrocarbons underground, methane or say oil, they're shown as black dots generally. If what we're talking about are repositories, maybe where you would put nuclear waste or carbon, then those are shown as blue dots. The green dots indicate locations where remediation may be occurring, and we're looking after microorganisms that may be carrying out that decontamination of an aquifer. The red dots indicate places where we may be extracting minerals using a microbial process, and we've had the benefit of coring in those locations to look at microbes. The smallest core that I passed around came from a site in Arizona where they use microorganisms to extract metals. And then all the white dots indicate places where we've had the good fortune of looking for microorganisms pretty much for basic science purposes to understand the distribution of these cells underground. And I guess the main thing that I'd like to say about what we have found is that more cells, more life exists underground by a long stretch of the imagination than exists at the surface. These have been called the unseen majority by a microbiologist over 10 years ago when he made these estimates. And of course, those of us who study this field became really excited that he had ascertained that in contrast to soils or water systems, subsurface organisms are dominant this way. Okay, so Marty already said that what we're going to do is try to force a quarter worth of discussion into one evening. And there are many ways you could probably do this. The way we're going to do it is using this imposing thing called the Drake equation. And it looks kind of bad, but it's not that bad. And even though Marty has up at the top, never use an equation in a presentation, we've done it because this is such a good way to promote discussion on the subject. And I think even if you can't work through all of the numbers tonight, you'll be curious about this. So what the Drake equation does is estimate n, which is the number of civilizations in the Milky Way Galaxy that are broadcasting their existence. Okay, so here's the equation, and no need to copy it down. You'll see it probably 20 times tonight, because we'll keep looking at it with respect to different variables as we go through them. And the way that you'll be using this equation is calculating probabilities, maybe the same way, if you really cared, if you were in Las Vegas, of calculating the probability of rolling a dice, a 6 on a die twice in a row. The chance of doing it once is 1 in 6. The chance of doing it twice is 1 in 36. And that's essentially how this equation works out. Interestingly, the variables that exist on the left side of this equation, we have a little better information on, or knowledge of, than those on this side. Some of these, which happen to, this one for instance, deals with the likelihood that intelligent life would develop on a planet. Of course, we don't have but one example there. But here, this is the rate of star formation, and we have a pretty good idea on that. Maybe as good an idea as we would have, I mean, I was thinking about having a beer before I started talking, and I said no. Whereas a pretty good understanding of the probability that I would have a beer before we started. So I'll have one afterwards. So let's see. You all have, or many of you should have, this table. And if you don't, you can share. And if we've run out of them, I have a couple others here. So this shows the equation up at the top. And then in the first column, the variables that are dealt with in the equation. And we'll go stepwise through this. The next column shows a description of the variable, sort of a brief explanation of it, and then possible values are listed there. And these are, in some cases they're debatable, but in some cases probably not. We've parameterized it, or the original equation has been parameterized fairly well. And then the units, if there are any, and then you can write here your choice. Now, before I hand it over to Marty to tell you about the first variable, I just want to say that the Drake equation is named after a fellow named Frank Drake, still alive, was in 1961 posed with the problem of presenting to a small group of colleagues on this question, the likelihood of intelligent life out there. And he derived this equation 50 years ago. And they talked about it. It's still being used. Now, I should say that it's not necessarily always used in a very scientific manner, but it's always used to promote discussion, just like we are tonight, hopefully. So sort of unhinge your imaginations and relax about some of the details that we have in here, and let's sort of be fluid in how we consider this. I think it goes now to you, Marty, to talk about R.
Thanks, Rick. So I think we wanted to say something more about that group that Frank Drake got together. Are you going to say that now? Did you want to say that now? So one of the members of the group was Carl Sagan, who you've probably all heard of, and the group was called the Order of the Dolphin. And so we're going to refer to the Order of the Dolphin a few times tonight because they're the ones that have came up with the values that we've put in your worksheet already. And these little dots just mean we're going to multiply all these things together. So I hope you brought your slide rules or calculators, because in the end we got to multiply these all together. So this is the rate at which stars form in our galaxy. And as Rick said, this is one of the variables that we actually know fairly well. So how do you determine a rate of something? Well, you got to know how many stars there are, and you got to know how old the galaxy is. So we'll just start with how many stars are in the galaxy, and that was one of the trivia questions. So this is an artist's image of the Milky Way Galaxy, and it's about 50,000 light years across. And our solar system is out here in the Orion arm, or local arm. And people have extrapolated by looking in various directions in the galaxy and by counting the density of stars in various places, and they've come up with this number, which was the number in the trivia question, 300 billion. Now, we're just talking about the Milky Way Galaxy. There are probably 100 billion or maybe 200 billion galaxies as well. So we're just talking about a little piece of the universe here. So we got a number of stars, and we want to know how long it took all of those stars to form to get a rate. So this is a little diagram of the age of the universe, starting with the Big Bang at 13.7 billion years ago. And sometime shortly after that, stars form. They assemble into galaxies. And probably somewhere around 10 billion years ago, the Milky Way Galaxy formed. And you can see down here, there's a little bit of absence of knowledge about exactly when that was. And some people would even say, actually, the Milky Way is really an old galaxy, and it should be out here, it should be 13 billion years ago. So you now have the two numbers you need to figure out the approximate rate at which stars are forming. So at this point, you all have to turn to your neighbors. Hope you like them, because you're going to be talking to them a lot during this. And you're going to get out the little worksheet, and you're going to fill in a number that goes in the very first box in the upper right, or up here. And they've given some clues. We've given you some clues over here as to what some typical values are. So just take a minute and fill in R, the rate at which stars have formed in the galaxy. I left out one piece. It's pretty much assumed that the rate of star formation has been the same from beginning to end.
So I'll tell you when a minute's up. Okay. 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 So I do get pretty loud. Okay. My S's were? Okay. Thanks. getting close to a minute. We started just before 6:15, I think. Yeah, I'm keeping an eye on it over there.
Yeah. Okay, so you've all got a number in there, in that box, and we're going to proceed to the next variable in the Drake equation, and that variable is PP, the probability that planets form around stars. So when stars are forming, I should have said what the rest of these variables are. This is the number of Earth-like planets. This is the probability that life will appear on a planet. This is the probability that it becomes intelligent. And finally, the probability that it will want to communicate or does communicate. And T is how long it's going to communicate. And we'll talk about each one of those as we go along. So the probability that a star has planets is something that the order of the Dolphin had no idea about, except that we have a star with some planets around it. They had one example. There were no known stars with other planets around them back in 1960 when they did this. But with several techniques, people have figured out that there were, up until the end of last month, they knew of about 430 stars and about 515 planets. So suddenly, very recently, we're starting to realize that there are a lot of planets out there. It's actually a really exciting time. So what happened recently is that, why I ended this at January 31st, is that a few years ago, or actually less than a few years ago, NASA put up this satellite called Kepler. And it's got a telescope in it, and it's aimed at a certain part of the sky where the Northern Star, Northern Cross, Cygnus, and Lyra are, and it's in between there. And it's looking at every star in these little boxes, about 150,000 of them, every few minutes to determine if they are dimming just a little bit. And they would be dimmed by a planet actually moving in between them and the camera. And they expect that about 1 in 200 of the, you have about 1 in 200 chance that the orbit of that planet is going to be such that it will actually cause an eclipse. And they released on February 1st a new estimate that there, within that area, there were probably about 1,200 new planets with new stars identified with planets going around them. So they started looking at a pretty small area, 150,000, and very quickly counted up about 1,000 or more planets with more stars with planets. So you don't really have that much to go on. But you have a lot more to go on than the order of the Dolphin did when they were trying to figure out what's the probability, PP, that a star has planets. Now, we know it's not 0, but we're probably sure it's probably not, the probability isn't 1. That would mean that every star has planets. Somewhere in between there, between 0 and 1. And you've got a little bit of information. And so now you got to turn to your neighbor again. Talk about how many planets, how many stars out there, what's the probability of stars having planets?
What's that? Yeah, so it's the second one. It's P sub P, and the estimate is what is the likelihood that a given star has any planets around it. And, okay. Yeah, I mean, it's unlikely to be 1 because that means every star has a planet, and we know that is not true. But, okay, yeah. No, he hasn't given the answer. next slide will have some sort of an estimate. So, you know, if you think that it's...
Okay, so you got a number in that second box now. We're gonna move along to the next parameter. So if you want to have life form on one of those planets going around those many stars, you got to have a planet that is somewhat Earth-like. Now we have to maybe define what an Earth-like planet is. One of the things is it's not going to be, probably most likely not going to be a big ball of gas like Jupiter or Saturn. It's most likely going to have some rock somewhere, and most likely it's going to have liquid water. One possibility also is it needs to have a moon that gives it a very stable orbit. But there's another factor, and it has to do with water. And if we're going to talk about carbon-based life, which is kind of limiting us, when we think that it has to have the planet has to have water, there's a very specific distance a planet can be from a star so that we'll have liquid water. And
Liquid at the surface or anywhere?
We'll get to that. But liquid, at least liquid at the surface. This has on this side has a scale, and that's the sun. So a moderate-sized star. Here's Gliese 581, which is a very much smaller star. And we know here are some of the planets around the Earth, and there are some of the planets around Gliese 581. Now, this blue zone is what's called the Goldilocks Zone, and that's because it's not too hot and it's not too cold. So if it's too hot, all the water there wouldn't have any liquid water on the surface; it would all be turned to steam. And if it's too cold, then the planet is kind of frozen all the way through. But since planets make their own heat from radioactive decay, there can be water on the inside even though the surface is frozen. So this Goldilocks zone for the sun has the Earth kind of smack dab in the middle. It has Mars kind of out on the edge, and Venus is on the inner edge. But right now, Venus is pretty hot. There's no liquid water on the surface. So I want to say a little bit more about what Nick's question was. Is it have to be liquid on the surface or in the interior? And that's where my research comes in a little bit. And I've been looking at life, or what I think evidence of life, in the inside of the Earth. And I'm going to go back to this rock real briefly. So the glassy outside, which I look at by cutting it into very thin slices and gluing it to a piece of glass, which is about 1.5 millimeters thick. And the piece of rock glued to it is only about a 3/30 of a millimeter thick. And so this is a picture of a piece of rock through a microscope, and it looks black. You know, when you pick it up, it looks black. But when you slice it thin and look at it through the microscope, it's perfectly clear. But what we're looking at is what was a crack that went through the rock. It got filled with this yellow-orange material, and it also has these tunnels that extend out from the crack into the solid rock. And some of them are segmented, they're wiggly, and they come in various sizes. That's just one example. And these are the things that we think the bacteria are making. We have not totally proved that, but we think that's happening. And we see really lots of varieties of these types of rock. This is another one. This one came from off the coast here. Here's the crack. Here's the yellow or orange material. And here's the tunnel. And in these cases, they end up in these kind of palm tree-like shapes. So after looking at many varieties of these thin slices of rock with these funny little tunnels in them, I started wondering, well, do we have a rock from Mars that might show the same kind of thing? And we do have rocks from Mars. And I asked NASA to loan me some, and they did. So we got the rocks probably because they were blasted off the surface of Mars by an impact. They orbited the sun for a while, and then they fell in as meteorites. And there are 4 of them here. This one at the top is the one that there was a lot of hullabaloo about because they thought they found fossils in it. Most people don't think that's true. The one that I worked on was this one, which was seen to fall in Egypt in 1911. And yeah, exactly 100 years ago. And we got the pieces of very thin rock from that Martian meteorite, and you can see it has these here's the solid rock, here's the crack with the orangey filling, and here are these little features that look an awful lot like the features on the terrestrial rocks. So we're working with bacteria that we hope we can actually prove that they will make these for us in the lab. It hasn't happened yet. When it does, it'll be really exciting. So back to NE. So for our solar system, we know we have at least one Earth-like planet. Maybe we have two. Mars might have had enough water to have life, and there may even be some evidence of it that we will find at some point. So you want to go back to your Drake equation worksheet and fill in what you think are the number of Earth-like planets for the stars that you think have planets. So that's just an N. It's a number like 1, 2, 3, 4. You fill in the next box of the Drake equation worksheet, and maybe you'll need to talk to your neighbors to figure that, to decide on a number. We'll do that real quickly.
Okay, so again, signal if I'm yelling too much. I get excited. Okay, so we're moving on to the next variable in the Drake equation. And this one's called PL, the probability of life appearing on that planet or on an Earth-like planet. And really we're going to ask what our one example, Earth, has to tell us about this probability. Okay, so before we get started, we sort of have to define what is life. What do we consider life? And what I've done is listed up here in this left-hand margin some of the characteristics of life, as biologists generally agree. Life has organization. It's composed of cells as we know it, transmits information, what we call heredity, from one generation to another. Life grows, replicates, metabolizes. It evolves and responds to an environment, and it adapts. It maintains homeostasis, or this ability to take care of its conditions within the cell, in some cases external to the outside world. And then it needs energy, space, prescribed environmental conditions. I've just sort of bunched these together. Now, biologists sometimes argue about a couple of these. I mean, viruses are often a provocative subject. Do they really constitute life or not? We won't worry about that right now. We can consider them to be alive or not, whatever. There are a lot of them out there. And most of these characteristics have been held firmly for a number of years, but one has had major, in a sense, expansion in terms of our understanding, and that's this last characteristic that life needs energy, space, and prescribed environmental conditions. So at one time, I guess, back when I was first studying biology, it seemed like the places where life could exist were fairly confined. But microbiologists over the last 30 years or so have really broadened or stretched our understanding of conditions where life can live. And that's, in a sense, where astrobiology comes to play in environmental microbiology, or vice versa. So I want to talk just briefly about a couple organisms that are interesting that way. In the upper left-hand portion of this slide, you see a photomicrograph of a cell that's about 2 microns across. That's taken in an electron microscope. And then right beneath it, you see a figure that shows on the y-axis generation time, and it scales up to about 30 hours. And then on the x-axis, temperature in degrees centigrade. And what this figure shows for an organism called strain 121 is that at temperatures about like your morning cup of coffee, if you're trying to sip it carefully so you don't burn your tongue, this organism is dividing about once every 10 hours. And then as you heat that system up, that organism at somewhere about 105 degrees centigrade, warmer than the boiling point of water at atmospheric pressure, it's really dividing optimally. That's what it likes. And then you turn up the heat even more up to 121 degrees centigrade, what you use in a pressure cooker, and the organism's still growing, still able to grow. So this information is, 30 years ago, microbiologists or biologists just didn't think of these organisms, and now they find them, I won't say routinely, but pretty often. In the lower right-hand corner of these images, there's another organism shown. This one we found in deep marine sediments off the coast of Japan. We were looking for organisms that could make methane. This one can make methane. It's sort of its final metabolic product. Instead of breathing out carbon dioxide, it breathes out methane. That's its waste product. And what's interesting about this organism, we wondered how it could live down in these sediments and survive when there's hardly any fluid moving through that system that we typically think of to keep an organism alive. So when we brought it back, isolated, we figured out we could grow it pretty rapidly. It would divide every 100 hours in the lab. That's fast for these organisms. And then we put it into this reactor that would sort of challenge it to go back into the conditions from which it came. It's a little mean, I admit, okay? Rescue it, grow it optimally, and then say, here, try this. And we put it back under these constrained conditions and slowed it down and then measured how fast it could grow. Because we knew it couldn't grow fast down there. There's no room to, no provision of anything. And what we found is that, if a human breathes about 20 times at rest, and a bear hibernating breathes about, 20 times a minute at rest, and a bear breathes about twice per minute when it's hibernating. This organism, and of course it doesn't have lungs, okay, but it turns over carbon and it takes a breath, a little tiny breath, about once every 5 minutes in comparison. So it can really go much slower than what we were able to estimate many years ago. So just 2 examples, but there are organisms that have been found that live in radioactive waste, that use energy that is infrared light. So if you put it on your stove next to a burner, that organism can grow just using the radiant energy from the stove. So these bizarre types of life have given us the idea that, well, maybe in other planets or other moons, even though it doesn't look so good on the surface, maybe there are places where life could exist. So the field of microbiology has given us some hope in that regard. Now, it is important to consider that these characteristics that I've listed are really life as we know it, right? So people would legitimately jump all over me and say, but you've only defined life according to how we see it. And alien life might be much different. Does life really require a way to collect energy? or a way to hold, or does it need to have chemical bonds that hold together, or a liquid environment, or Darwinian evolution? Does it in fact, or do we have what we would call carbon chauvinism? That is, we believe that life has to be composed of carbon. That's what we see here, that it's one of the central elements, or could it really have something else? So these are things obviously we don't know about. We can look, but it's pretty hard. Marty was talking about the shadow biosphere, and something unusual or odd could be different than what we can imagine. Okay, so we're still getting to that variable. This goes back to the timeline, and it's an abbreviated timeline compared to what Marty showed you before he was showing beginning of the universe. What we're just looking at here is the age of the Earth. So the Earth formed on the far left-hand side about 4.5 billion years ago. And if we go all the way to the right side of this slide, that's today. And you can see some of the early events on the left-hand side, the formation of the Earth, formation of the moon. And what's really critical for the probability that life would occur is that not long after what was referred to as the late heavy bombardment ended, that's when the Earth was being pelted, pretty bad hailstorm, just pelted by meteors hitting the surface of it. Not long after that, what you see is the first evidence in sediments that life started. So it was within really a few, I think the estimate is within a few 100 million years or less that you have the first evidence of life. So, one interpretation of that is that it didn't take much time for things to settle down and life got started. Okay, so that takes you to PL. We've been talking about the probability of life appearing on that planet, and you have to answer this question: is life unique to Earth? If it is, then you can put a low number in that spot. If life is not unique to Earth, then maybe a number that's a little bit closer to 1. Okay, go ahead. Okay, we're on to the next variable. This is the probability of intelligent life evolving on the planet. And again, we can only infer this from the single example that we have, what's happened here on Earth. Now you can see Stephen Hawking's perspective on this. There were kind of a smart breed of monkeys on a minor planet of an average star, but hey, something special happened here. So that's perhaps a first step in considering this. And I want to return to this timeline now, which, remember we were talking about the end of the late heavy bombardment happening here at about 3.8 billion years ago. Well, at about right around that same time, you see the earliest isotopic evidence for life. That means life got started, but consider how long it took for apparently intelligent life to occur. It really took close to that 4 billion years before something that we would consider, I suppose, intelligent arose, very recently only. And there are a few factors that appear to account for that, or that are important on Earth at least for that happening. One is this, I've made a reference here to what are called cyanobacteria. So not long after life started on the planet, life figured out a way to use light as a source of energy. And it figured it out in a couple different ways, but one of the ways it figured out how to do it ended up producing this stuff we call oxygen. Now, the planet, the oxygen on the planet before that time was sort of bound up in rocks, and everything was just fine and cozy. But these microbes, these cyanobacteria, or algae some people call them, they ruined it for a lot of organisms. They started making oxygen, which, as it turns out, is very toxic to many forms of life. The only reason we can deal with it is because organisms that use oxygen have figured out ways to deal with the toxicity of oxygen. So they changed this planet probably forever by creating oxygen. It took a long time, but eventually, several billion years later, oxygen was high enough in the atmosphere that we had other events start to happen, and that is that cells developed that had nuclei. This means a more complex type of cell. And then gradually, we began to see higher levels of life, and ultimately the life that we see here. None of that would have been possible without oxygen and the ability that it provides life to gain energy, which is kind of a long story in itself. So the advent of oxygen helped this happen. There's another important thing to keep in mind. If you go back to Marty's figure that shows the sun as a star in Gliese and the Goldilocks Zone, okay, so one of the key aspects there is that our sun is lasting long enough. It's not burning up or anything, so that this long period of time, this long stretch of time, will allow life to become intelligent. So the sun is about halfway through its lifetime. I think most people say about 9 billion years, and it's about 4.5 billion years through that. And it took about that long for life to become intelligent. So that's, I think, a consideration in this. Okay, so here's where you are. Probability of intelligent life evolving on the planet. Is it certain that intelligent life will evolve? These are some of the questions I suppose you can ask. How long does it take life to become intelligent? How long might it last? So I'll give you a minute to fill in your guess. Yep?
I'd just like to ask you, your next probability is intelligence plus electromagnetism. So we're looking for intelligence that doesn't necessarily produce electromagnetism.
That's right, exactly. Does everybody hear that? So he is asking, he said the next variable has to do with the likelihood that intelligent life would include with it electromagnetism. We're not including that in this variable. This is just whether life becomes intelligent, okay? The next variable we'll talk about electromagnetism or okay, we're almost done. Okay, so the next variable, the probability that intelligent life has the ability and the will to communicate. And some of the questions here have to do with what might limit the ability, what determines the will, how would one communicate. Okay, so many people have heard about SETI. Marty mentioned it earlier. Last April, no, this April, it's 51 years old. The SETI is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and it was started by Frank Drake, who started the equation, who wrote the equation. And there are a lot of opinions about SETI. Chris McKay, who's an astrobiology researcher with NASA, says it's a lot of listening to nothing by radio telescopes pointed at nearby stars. And that's, I mean, it's a pretty respectful comment. He's not slamming it. He's a part of this whole effort, but I think that's accurate. And there have been some considerations about why we haven't heard anything during this search. Some of the reasons are listed there. Paul Davies has listed them in his new book. And I think Frank Drake has also considered them. So it's possible that Earth is the only place for life. Of course, that's one possibility. Also that life is common, but intelligence is rare. Or possibly, maybe science is unique to Earth. That is, maybe there's intelligent life, but it hasn't developed in such a way that it could communicate through the development of science. Also possibly that intelligence signals may be out there, but we just can't recognize them. There's some really interesting ideas here that, I mean, you can read anything like, it's all around us, or it's coded in our DNA, left there by some aliens. We just don't know it yet, but we'll find the message sooner or later. Or, and this one's kind of dour, maybe intelligent beings can't survive their own technology. And we can all think of reasons why we might pursue that tack. Okay, so this is the search for intelligent life, our looking, but we have sent deliberate messages out. Many of you may be aware of this. So this shows in the upper right, this shows the gold plaque that traveled on 2 different Pioneer missions in the early 70s. And in the lower left-hand corner, the golden record that traveled on 2 different Voyager missions, also in the 70s. If you look at these, you can generally get an idea of what they're saying, but some of the details are a little obscure. I mean, for instance, if you look at the Pioneer plaque, the large one here, you can see that it shows the spacecraft, which planet it came from, in order from the sun and so on. It shows humans and their rough size relative to the size of the spacecraft. And this star-shaped appearance actually tells whoever might find it how to find Earth or the sun and this solar system based on a set of pulsars that exist around it. And down in the lower left-hand corner, I mentioned this golden record. This is kind of cool. This has a stylus with it and instructions so that anybody who finds it can play the record. You can get online, you can find the sounds that have been put on it. I mean, it was great. Carl Sagan went through what they would put on this, and they put, Beethoven's Fifth, and you can listen to a thunderstorm and a dog barking. It's intriguing to listen to and how they came up with it. But of course, you have to figure out how to play it, So I'd recommend going to play it. Now, we have also sent another deliberate message that is referred to generally as the erasable binary code. And it was sent by this radio telescope in the lower left-hand corner that's in Puerto Rico. And in 1974, Frank Drake and Carl Sagan and a few others sent this radio message. It was aimed at M13, a globular cluster. Is it 20,000 light years away?
25, yeah.
25. So they aimed it at this globular cluster. So you can tell, it's going to take a while to get there. If anybody hears it or knows what it's saying, then it's going to take a while to come back, the answer to come back. So it's it's a good try, good faith effort. May not reach anybody, but it's on its way there. Now, this was sent as a radio message in binary code, which is just on, off, that sort of thing. This picture that you see sort of in the center and on the right, if you're smart enough to deconvolute this code that was sent out, and I should say, order the Dolphin, when Frank Drake gave it to them, they couldn't figure it out. Okay? So those are some pretty smart people, but they couldn't figure it out. You have to figure out that it's in 23 columns of 73 rows. And if you look at it in a different way, say 73 columns in 23 rows, it makes no sense. Okay, but if you get the code right, in a sense, you can begin to figure it out. And we've sketched out here that the top part of it tells you that we count in base 10 here. It also gives information about some of the key atomic numbers of biological elements, formulas for DNA. The double helix is in there. In the middle here, you can probably all see a shape of a human. It gives the approximate size of a human right here. Just to the left of it, this is the population of the planet Earth in humans at the time that this was sent. And this is the erasable telescope. And it tells where it came from. So, there's a lot of angst when this was sent, in a sense, because I don't believe that Frank and the others asked permission. And yet a lot of people thought, you should really talk to the international audience about whether this, or international, people and so on, to understand that what you're sending out here, could be just fine, but it could also be a dinner bell. That's what a lot of people have said, And it sort of tells you what to come prepared to eat and how much of it, how big it is. So that's just the way some people have viewed it. And I don't know that it's been sent more than once, but it's headed out there. Okay, and I did mention that these messages were deliberate messages sent, but as was pointed out earlier, there's a lot that's been happening lately that is not necessarily deliberate. I mean lately, the last century or two, and that is radio communications, make this planet sort of fizzle with information coming from it that would not look plain in any sense. And, anywhere from radio communications to, say, the odd nuclear weapon going off says something's happening here. Okay, so this is P sub C, the probability that intelligent life has the ability and the will to communicate. The next to the last one. Okay, so the last variable, which should help you to complete this calculation, is the duration in years that intelligent life communicates. How many years will a society try to communicate? And you can take this probably from two different perspectives. You can take the optimistic perspective and you can say, long-lived civilization, it's going to last 1 million years, and during that time, it's going to be communicating. So that would be a pretty big number for T. If you're a pessimist, then you might use a T of something around 50 years. And I think that, Marty, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the way that this was arrived at was, well, Marconi first discovered radio waves and was able to communicate. Yeah, radio waves, but then it was not long after that that we figured out how to destroy ourselves. And we haven't done it yet, of course, but we've had that capability. So a pessimistic period would be just 50 years. Did somebody say something? I mean, okay, so here you can fill in T in the Drake equation, and I'll give you a little extra time, because now you're going to try to come up with the whole calculation. So Marty, sorry, Marty forgot to tell me that, to remind you that you have to multiply them all together. That's the deal, and that's your answer then, okay? And maybe you all knew that.
Okay, yeah. So you all brought your calculators. I mentioned that. And if you didn't bring your calculator, you get out your cell phone, because I think most cell phones have a calculator on them, and you can just put your numbers in, multiply them together, and hit equals at the end. Yet? You have to yell. So what's a kind of a small number that somebody got? Like 10,000? 1 in 10,000. So very low number. 1 times 10 to the minus 6, so 1 in a million. Anybody get a big number? David said that's ridiculous. N for N, yeah. Yeah. So when the Order of the Dolphin did this, they came out with a minimum number of 20 communicating civilizations in our galaxy. But maybe they were a little more optimistic. They also came out with a maximum number of about 1 million. Frank Drake himself today thinks that there are about 10,000 communicating civilizations in our galaxy. And he also thinks that the technology for looking at each of these stars, now they're looking at each star to see if it dims a little bit because there's a planet going around it. The technology for looking for radio waves on these stars is getting so good that in the next 20 or 30 years, we will have looked at several million stars and looked for radio waves. And there's some reasons why we might not see anything. But if we don't, some people say, well, that means that life is really rare in the galaxy. 1 million, yeah. So it's possible that we would have to reconsider in 20 or 30 years saying, well, really, we've looked at so many stars. We see no radio waves coming off planets from them. Maybe life is really extremely rare. So that's where we want to end it. And I do want to thank my wife for coming and spending her Valentine's Day evening with me, and my daughter. They're sitting in the audience. And so I guess we'll just open it up for questions at this point. Yes?
There's some significance to that 1679 seconds.
Yeah, so the question was, the erasable message got transmitted for 1679 seconds. And I don't know why they did it exactly that long.
But only one time, right?
It's actually, they repeated the message several times in that period.
Isn't it the product of the prime numbers? Although
I don't know.
the 23 by 70,
Well, I don't know what that is.
73.
Yeah. Yes? The question was, what did the order of the dolphin use for T, the length of time? And they were pretty optimistic. They thought that civilization would be around for quite some time. And they could have used a number as high as 1 million years. And if you look at the equation carefully, you'll see that most of the parameters kind of cancel each other out. So that it's really the T which determines the number of communicating civilizations. So when they said maybe there's 1 million out there, it's because they said that the civilization would be around for 1 million years. Sure. That's true. We have to be listening at the same time they exist. Yeah. So that's a problem.
One of the slides you had, you showed early evidence, I think it was labeled isotopic evidence of life. Do we have any sense of what processes or what happened to create the first primordial life that we don't have any physical evidence of? How that happened?
You want to do it?
Yeah, of course, we don't have that evidence that you're referring to, but researchers, mostly biologists, microbiologists, have done very simple studies in how the primary cell type features have come together, and they can make it happen to form these sort of pseudocells with very simple ingredients, such as what would be provided by carbon-like molecule or carbon molecules, organic molecules coming in from space. And so most of this work is being done at Harvard, some prominent work at Harvard right now. And they see these primordial life type objects forming up almost spontaneously under the right conditions.
This is way beyond Miller-Urey.
Yes, yes, uh-huh.
How often is the class offered and what prerequisites are there?
Repeat it.
How often is the class offered and what are the prerequisites? That was the question. It's offered every spring, and we normally have people in the Honors College taking the class, but if it's not full, we can have other people be a part of the class. And the last few years, it hasn't been full, so we took a graduate student last year, and the year before, Charlie Tomlinson, the mayor, joined us. He's got a really deep interest in this, and we said, sure, Charlie, come along. So.
Was Charlie beginning to doubt the existence of intelligence on this planet?
Go ahead.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so there's a lot of pieces to this answer. That's the reason why. So the question was, how do we know that the rocks came from Mars and the rocks that we have on Earth from Mars? And first of all, most meteorites have a very characteristic look to them. They're not all big chunks of iron. Some are rocks, but they don't look like a volcanic rock. And what they found were there were a few rocks that were clearly had landed from space, and they looked like they had come out of a volcano. That was one piece. So they looked very different from all other meteorites. And then they can determine the age of meteorites. And most meteorites are about the same age as the solar system, about 4.5 billion years. So these funny looking meteorites that were volcanic rocks, some of them were only 1 billion years old. So they knew they had to have come out of a volcano 1 billion years ago. And when you're looking around the solar system, you've got the Earth, you might have Venus, you've got big volcanoes on Mars. They started to think, well, where is this rock going to have come from? And then the real key piece of evidence was that the Viking lander that went to Mars in 1976 measured the composition of the atmosphere. They knew exactly how much carbon dioxide and nitrogen and a number of other gases. And some very smart person asked NASA for a little piece of one of these Martian meteorites, and he melted it and extracted all the gas out of it, and it had the exact same gas composition as the Martian atmosphere. And that kind of locked it in, that there were this small group of volcanic rocks on Earth that had actually come from Mars. There's 34 right now. And if you find one, they're probably worth about $1,000 a gram. And there was one found in the Mojave Desert not too long ago, and people are roaming over the Sahara where they can land and be preserved and picking up any kind of meteorite, and they're pretty valuable. Sure, we're in the back. Yep, that's you.
Do you know if there's meteorites from any other bodies besides Mars?
Yeah, we get meteorites from. The question was, where do we get meteorites from other places? And we get meteorites from the moon as well. I don't think they've ever seen a meteorite from the Earth, which I'm hoping they would find. That means something that hit the Earth, it went into space and came back later, but it's not happened yet. Now.
It seems like here on Earth we have microbes that can do weird metabolism. They live really hot. They don't need oxygen. On the other hand, we've got some multicellular organisms that are more complex. Any theoretical reason why multicellular life couldn't do weird metabolism?
Yeah. So the question is, why can't multicellular life do weird metabolism?
That's a good question. I should know right away. So yeah, many of these environments are, so why would multicellular life not be able to do this? I'm going to have to think about this a little bit. But many of the environments don't have oxygen where these organisms are existing. In fact, in many cases, oxygen is toxic for them. So they avoid it, and they're, in some cases, believed to be some of the original life forms because they've descended from places or times when there was very little oxygen around. So it's a good one. I should probably know it.
A couple months ago, there was that NASA press release about arsenic-based, or using life that used
Yeah.
arsenic instead of phosphorus. What is the current, like, what do people think about that and how, and what is your take on it?
Yeah, so the question is related to the press release and the paper in Science Journal, in Science, a few months ago about the life forms that apparently could substitute arsenic for phosphorus in their cellular chemicals like DNA. In general, the scientific community believes that that was a hastily done study and published a little too early. And there are a number of reasons. One, for instance, is that the stability of a type of DNA that had arsenic in it instead of phosphorus wouldn't allow that molecule, that macromolecule, to hold together. But there's several. And my particular perspective is pretty much in line with that. You know, I've looked at the paper and I've looked at some of the comments, and I wouldn't argue. I think that it is a little hasty, although this is one of the key substitutions that is often discussed. So it's not surprising that somebody would try to do this experiment. Yes, carbon and silicon being the other. Mm-hmm.
There's a question over here. Okay.
Is there any, I don't want to say consensus, but any opinion of why life? It's just an accident that really lowers one of these probabilities here, but if there's, say, a physical reason,
Yeah, so the question is life just an accident, or is it really driven by some principle? Is that about it?
Is that the biological imperative?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are Nobel Prize winners on both sides of that, both extremes. There is one who says that life is the biological imperative, that it just happens naturally when you have the right material together, when you have water and carbon and nitrogen, it's just going to happen. And there's another Nobel Prize winner who says it's just an odd accident, and that it's really going to be extremely rare. So we got really smart people on both sides of that question.
Sorry.
In the first case you mentioned, who is that person, and do they have a hypothesis, or is it just a conjecture that it's not an accident?
Question was who thinks it's an imperative. His name's Christian de Duve, and he's written a book about that imperative. Yeah, so he's saying that the molecules will form in the environment to make something living. Yeah. Way in the back. I didn't hear the question. I don't know what that is, sorry.
In the middle 70s, they actually picked up something in erasable. The trouble is, it wasn't real time. They found a blip while they were looking over their records. They pointed the telescope in that section of the sky and never saw it.
So when this is a question about a signal received from Arecibo, in Arecibo, the only one I know of which was was a fluke was actually in the the radio telescope in West Virginia, and they did actually get a signal almost immediately upon putting it on a star, and they moved it off the star, and of course the signal went away, and they went back to the star and it was gone, and then they realized there was some sort of fluke. I don't know of any others.
If you look at WOW signal in Wikipedia, they have an article.
Okay.
I think two more questions. Yep.
If this crowd demanded an answer from you, would you say all is said and done and it's been thoroughly studied, will we find there hasn't been life on Mars?
The question is, if they demanded a question, would we find life on Mars? Would we? So you want to know our opinion, I guess. And I think my opinion is there's about a 90% chance that there's life on Mars. Obviously not intelligent life, but the environments are so similar to environments that we can find on Earth. I think when we do a really thorough study of Mars, we will find something living there. And it's possible we'll find it on other bodies in the solar system, like in Europa, which has a very icy surface and water underneath, and a couple others.
I wouldn't argue with that. I think it's quite possible.
Okay. One more?
Have there been asteroids or anything that struck the Earth from outside the asteroid belt?
So I think the question is, there have been things from outside the asteroid belt, and there are comets which are outside the asteroid belt. But I'm wondering if your question is outside the solar system.
Specifically from the asteroid belt or any of the gas giants or a comet. And if so, you talked about analyzing the atmosphere. What about analyzing atmosphere from those, or from an asteroid? If it used to be a planet.
I'm not sure if that's been done. So the question is, should we analyze the gas from an asteroid? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that one.
Sounds like another thesis possibility. Well, thank you. Can we give a hand to our speakers?
I'm going to stay around so I could ask any more questions. Okay.
Marty will stay around. Rick, will you be around for a bit? Both of them will be around to answer other questions if you have other things to run by them. Next month, we'll be back here on March 14th and be hearing from Elizabeth Schuyler at Good Samaritan Hospital on the subject of the physics